Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir. How you going?
Yeah, pretty good. Yourself?
Doing well personally, but I have to say I've been very dismayed with what's happened over the last 4 or 5 weeks with the policy response to the coronavirus. I think that the consequences of what has been done. I don't think a lot of people really understand the scale of what's been done and how long these decisions in 4 weeks, 5 weeks will stick with Australians for many years to come.
No, you're right. There is a significant impact. And I guess if you stand back and think globally with what the Fed has done as well, we are in really uncharted territory. And I guess, John, we should just explain that because of the situation with the virus, you and I are recording this via Skype. There will be some slides and things to show as we go through, but there won't be a picture of John Adams on the show today.
Correct.
And some would say that's a good thing. Some would say that's a bad thing. I'll leave that to others. Now, the point, though, is that really things have changed dramatically within just a few weeks. And it's all to do with what people have reacted to and how they have reacted to the virus. And the question, I guess, is, John, is whether the reaction has been calibrated right, whether it's been the right reaction, or indeed whether we're going down completely the wrong direction.
Of course. So over the last 3 weeks, Martin, 3-4 weeks, I've been looking at the data coming from around the world about the virus, about the lockdown, the stimulus. I've been listening to a lot of what the politicians have been saying. And so probably a few points to make. So the first thing is that, last weekend, I actually published on my website a 6,300 word essay about what my position is, and the title of the article is the title of the show, that the economy has been destroyed within 4 weeks. So we'll put that on the screen. I'd recommend people go read that, because that has a lot of footnotes, 70 footnotes, and that's my considered position on that. So we'll go through a part of it today. So we should also say that today is part one of a two-part show. So today I want to focus on the decision to lock down the economy, because the stimulus, which is a complete disaster, is predicated on the decision to lock down the economy. So I think we need to consider whether the lockdown was the right decision or not. And that's what we'll discuss today. And in part two, we'll talk about the economics of it and what does it mean in the short term, but also in the medium to long term. So the other thing I think we should say, Martin, is that you and I have had many discussions off camera about this whole situation. There are some things that we agree on, and there are some things where we can't see eye to eye. And usually when we do these shows, we are very much on the same page. So what we're going to do in this episode is, I think what we'll do is cover the key aspects of where we agree, and then where we disagree. I will make my case, and you'll have the opportunity to respond. And we'll have to obviously just leave it up to the audience to make their judgment as to who has the better argument.
And I guess it's worth saying, John, that the trouble is at the moment, of course, the data is partial and therefore subject to a number of different interpretations depending on the way that you look at it. And that's part of the issue. And then I think there are also some philosophical issues that you and I probably will have different points of view on too. So it should be an interesting show.
Absolutely. So Martin, so I think the first place to start is where you and I agree. Now, what I should say is that so is it fair to say, Martin, that you and I agree that the lockdown of the economy has been horrific from an economic point of view?
Yeah, there's no doubt that the fallout from the decision to lock it all down has been pretty amazingly bad. I mean, look at the unemployment rate already rising. We know that firms are folding. We know that so many parts of the economy are very much under pressure. But on the other hand, you could also argue that the slowdown started quite slowly and probably late to the piece. And had they acted a bit quicker, then maybe we could have got through this quicker too.
Yeah. So now, So in terms of, so I agree with all that. So in terms of where we sort of agree even further is that you and I filmed a show on Australia Day, and we'll put that show we'll put that up on the screen, and the show was called Has Chinese biological WMD penetrated Australia? So by late January, there was enough information saying that something very unusual was happening in Wuhan in China, and that we needed to take some early action then. So in that show, and people can go back and look at that show, I mean, we basically said that by mid-January, flights from Wuhan were still coming into Sydney. That made no sense. When people were coming into the country from China, there was no temperature testing. There was no sort of any form of screening that was happening at the airports. People were just given pieces of paper and basically said, if you feel sick, contact this number. Whereas in places like Singapore, they actually had a very aggressive testing regime in terms of temperatures and making sure that they try to pick up who was obviously looking and feeling sick. So I think where we agree is that had you and I been Prime Minister, Treasurer, leading this country, we would have stopped the flights in mid-January coming from not just Wuhan, from China. We would have had proper screening at ports of entry, and it's just not airports but seaports as well. And we would have actually prevented the spread from coming in. Now, I believe that if we took aggressive action to lock down the border in January, we would have avoided the need to lock down the entire economy and society as we have done now. And we would have avoided the need to spend the amount of stimulus that we've spent. And again, we'll talk about this in part 2, but in the first 4 weeks of in terms of the policy response, and the policy response started on the 12th of March of 2020, when you look at fiscal and monetary policy from federal, state and territory governments combined, $417 billion. That was my calculation. And again, it's all in the article. People can look at how did I come up with that number. But basically, had we taken aggressive early action in January, no lockdown of civil society, no stripping of civil and political rights, and no need for a stimulus package of $400 billion. So would you say that's fair, that that's where we agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it would have obviously impacted students, it would have impacted tourism, and it would have impacted some other industries, but it would not have been the whole freeze that we now have. And essentially, because we let too many people back into the country with the virus, it got away from us. And I think the cruise ships are also part of the puzzle, but the airlines clearly is where it all started. And I think the other point to make, John, is that clearly there were infections coming in from the US that nobody detected, including, the US area. So maybe the clampdowns should not just have been to China or Wuhan, but there should have been more aggressive testing of people coming into the country sooner. Had we done that, there would have been some minimal fallout in some specific industries, which could have been supported to an extent. But the bulk of the population and the bulk of the activity in the country could have continued. And yet, because we were late to the party and because we were trading off, relationships with China and all those other economic issues, we basically left it probably 6 weeks too late.
Totally. Now, probably there's a couple of additional points I want to make. So the first thing is, by the time we filmed our show in January, Hong Kong had already declared a state of an emergency. North Korea had already stopped the flights from China. So we already had examples of borders shutting down before Australia Day, well before, say, the United States. And this is a really important point, Marty, because I've seen Morrison on a couple of press conferences and addresses to the nation to say that Australia was one of the first countries to take early action to lock down the border. Well, that's a categorically false statement by Morrison, complete spin, and the facts, if people check the timeline, that doesn't stack up. Another key point is that the World Health Organization was way too late in declaring, they declared in March the pandemic, but there was a number of stages of declaration from the WHO. Well, certain countries in Asia didn't even wait for the World Health Organization. They just took action because the data seemed on the ground that action was required, and I think that was a critical mistake that we did by relying on them. A lot of mixed messages from government and from the chief medical officer. On one day, don't shake. So it was okay to shake hands. 48 hours later, don't shake hands. Social distancing, etc. So there was never a clear message. There was never a clear understanding of what was going on. And I think incompetence by politicians and senior officials was a contributing factor to the disaster that we have now. One of the things that I covered in my article is I actually went back and looked at what happened in the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, 1919. Now, in World War I, Australia lost 60,000 soldiers due to the war. But in the pandemic, we only lost 15,000 Australians due to the flu. Now, worldwide, the flu killed many more people. Any estimates between 30 to 100 million people worldwide died from the flu, and that was magnitudes times greater than how many people died in World War I. So why did we had one of the lowest death rates in the developed world during the pandemic 100 years ago? So how did we do that? We actually had early and effective quarantine. So we locked down the ports. We had rigorous testing for those we allowed to come through our seaports, and those who were sick were placed in strict quarantine, and they were isolated. So yes, there was some parts of civil society that was closed down, like large public gatherings, but work didn't stop, church services didn't stop, and we didn't have to go to the extremes that we did, and obviously we didn't actually have no record stimulus package in 1919 coming from state or federal governments, and so we'll get into this in part two. I think the stimulus had nothing to do with the public health issue. It actually had everything to do with the debt bubble, and that's one of the things I've sort of argued in my piece. But so I think the key point here is that we have historical experience of when you do take early action, a lot of what we're seeing today doesn't have to happen, and we did that 100 years ago, and we were pretty successful when you look at us compared to a whole bunch of people around the world. So that's point one. And then obviously, I've sort of touched on about Hong Kong and North Korea and how they've sort of took early action. But you look at Singapore, you look at South Korea, they did not lock down their economies. I think Singapore has started to do a couple of additional steps, but neither country nor Taiwan has gone to, or Japan has gone to the full extent that the Morrison government has done because of the type of regime that they did. Now, in these countries, they got caught short when SARS and MERS came out, and so they, well before coronavirus, they actually took a very serious approach in terms of officials and scientists to make sure that if a pandemic or if a health crisis was to blow out, they actually had a plan, an effective plan of how they're going to address with that. And that's what they did. So South Korea in particular had a pre-packaged plan that they rolled out, and that was very successful. And that's why when you see infection rates and death rates in some of these countries, they got on top of the issue much earlier than what we did, and they did not have to lock down their economy. So when people say there was no choice but to lock down, I think where you and I agree is whether you look at the approaches in Asia or whether you look at the historical approach that Australia took 100 years ago, if we actually had a competent government, we could have actually got on top of this issue earlier, and the lockdown and the stimulus would not have been needed.
Yeah, I agree, John. And it's worth saying two quick points. The first is the pandemic plan that they sort of waived, when they started talking about this, was a repurposed plan. It had basically been built some time ago on the assumption that it would be an influenza type hit that we were going to take. The fact is that the coronavirus doesn't really behave much like influenza. It's much more like SARS. So those countries up in Asia that were exposed to SARS had a much better handle on how to react. The second point I think it's worth making is that there is now a retelling of history by a lot of people who start to claim somehow that they acted earlier and they acted right. The fact is, if you look at the timeline, we were late to the party, we made some bad decisions early on, and we're now counting the cost.
Precisely. Now, one question for you, Martin, is obviously our system of government in Australia comes from the UK, and obviously you were born in England. So, you, given that you're a dual citizen, and we have this issue of ministerial accountability. We had massive incompetence with the bushfires. So when we did our show about the bushfires, I think that was in early January, and we talked about how there were bushfire scientists who were warning about fuel loads going back 2 or 3 years ago, in Victoria, for example, and the issue of the bushfires could have been avoided if expert scientific advice was taken. But we had massive incompetence from bureaucrats, basically from official bureaucrats and from politicians. And we had a catastrophe on the bushfires. So we're now saying that we had more incompetence from politicians and bureaucrats in the lack of an early response to the coronavirus. And yet my issue is that with the whether it's the bushfires or whether it's with this issue, no one's resigned, no one's been sacked, there's no accountability. These politicians won't take a pay cut. And we'll get into that at some point and soon. During the Great Depression, federal politicians took a 15% pay cut, and yet when the Victorian Premier has enjoyed a pay rise of 11% in the last 2 months, Morrison refuses to take a pay cut, even though he's bankrupting the country. And yet it seems to me that from a political point of view, the political system, we're in a political crisis because there is mass incompetence and there's no accountability. And the system we have came from England. And the customs of England is that if you screw up, you resign and you move on.
Well, except I don't think that's true currently, because I would argue that the UK handling of the virus has been even worse than here in Australia, with their attempts to go through the herd immunity stage and then suddenly changing tack, and then all of the current issues. Of course, they've got massive issues there. But yeah, in the past, people would have taken accountability, and frankly, they'd have fallen on their swords if they really stuffed up. None of that seems to happen now, neither in the UK nor indeed here. And what it means is that basically those politicians are Teflon coated. They can do whatever they like, they can say whatever they like, and nobody holds them to account. And certainly the mainstream media aren't doing their job. So essentially they can do and say pretty much anything and get away with it.
And I have to say, that to me says that our system of parliament has broken down.
Well, I think it has, on the principle that if you go back to the fundamental design of the way the democracy was meant to work, there is an accountability within those representatives, and if they do stuff up, they are meant to react accordingly. But no, these days, they don't seem to care. Yeah.
Now, what we've just discussed, Martin, is where you and I agree. Now, the more controversial part of the show is where we don't agree. Now, so we both have just said, had we been in charge of the country, we would have taken early action in January. There would have been a hit in certain sectors of the economy, like with higher education and tourism, maybe the airlines as well to a certain degree, but no need for a lockdown of civil society and basically no massive stimulus package. So where we disagree is, had we, and so this goes back to some of our off-camera discussions in March, is, well, had we inherited the situation in March, what would we have done at that point? Would we have locked down the country in March or not? Now, I think it's fair to say that you said you would, and I say that I won't, that I wouldn't, and I still wouldn't, and I still think the lockdown should stop immediately, and we should actually have a more strategic approach to actually dealing with the health crisis. Now, why do I say that? So I'm going to go through 3 key points, and then I'll hand it over to you, Martin. So the first one is, so there's an issue of modelling. So why have the governments around the world locked down their economies It comes down to forecast and modelling, and even though Christopher Joy and I have butted heads in the past, I have to say Christopher Joy wrote a very good piece in the AFR this week, published on Friday. I would encourage people to go read what he wrote. Basically, you had a whole bunch of medical professors who basically came up with projections based on theoretical simulations. So there was no empirical data behind these simulations. Now, so the first claim was that if left unmitigated, 40 million people around the world would die from the coronavirus. President Trump was told that 2 million Americans would die without mitigation. Boris Johnson was told 250,000 British citizens would die from the virus without mitigation. And I've seen one source that says that Scott Morrison apparently was told that 150,000 Australians were told that 150,000 Australians would die without mitigation. Now, the question is, well, what was the basis of these claims? Now, in the case of the World Health Organization, Trump and Johnson, Boris Johnson, this came from Imperial College. So there's a particular professor, Professor Neil Ferguson. He has a horrendous forecasting record. He did some forecasts with the swine flu 10 years ago. His numbers were way off. So there's a number of key issues with his work that suggests that people shouldn't rely on his work. Now, Oxford University did a rival study and came out with a very different set of results in terms of their simulations. Now, Oxford has said on the record they don't understand why everyone was relying on one university's outcomes and why their work wasn't treated with the same level of gravity and weight. So now the other key aspect of what Neil Ferguson did was he has a particular code that a software code he uses as part of his model. He's never released that. He says that he wrote that in 2007. Now, good science would say that if you are developing a model, you publish the model, including the software code, and you get other scientists to check the veracity of this. So one of the criticisms that you and I have had about CoreLogic is CoreLogic won't actually won't show the public how do they come up with their daily hedonic index numbers. And they just say, take it on trust. We spend $20 million a year, and our results are accurate. So the fact that Ferguson hasn't released the software code, and he won't actually say exactly how his numbers are calculated. That's problematic from a good science point of view. But the forecast that he has put out in the past have been wrong, and I think these forecasts that he's put out this time have also been wrong. So that's probably point one. In terms of my objections, is that the decision to lock down was based on these exaggerated modelling results. So that's point one. Now my second objection is that in terms of the infection rates. So there's a couple of key points to say on this. Is now Iceland has the most rigorous testing regime in the world for COVID-19, and according to their results, 50% of those who tested positive for the virus are asymptomatic, which means that they have no symptoms. The Diamond Princess, which is this cruise ship that was in Japan, they had an asymptomatic patient rate of about 46.5%. I've seen other estimates from other studies that are saying that asymptomatic patients could be up to 60%. So in Australia, we have seen in the press over the last 1 or 2 weeks to say that the infection rate has peaked. I think I read one source that said that the infection rate peaked on the 29th of March, and that the new level of cases has been declining ever since then. And now people are talking about the potential of eradicating the virus. Well, so the key issue is in Australia, unless if you have severe symptoms, you can't get a test. And because a good chunk of those who have the virus are asymptomatic, we do not have accurate numbers on the infection rate, and the infection rate is way higher than what we're being told. And if the infection rate is way higher, it means that the lethality of the virus is much slower. So that's point. So that's point one on the infection issue. Now, now in terms of the test, now there are more tests being approved by a whole host of medical boards around the world of how do you test for this virus. But the initial global test it's called this RT-PCR test that has been largely used. Now, according to one scientific study, that they said that this particular test, this RT-PCR test, has a false negative rating or test result of 30%. So that means that 30% who took the test and the test says you don't have it, no, you actually have it. So that means again that people within Australia or people around the world who are being told you don't have the virus, you actually do have the virus, which means that the infection rate again is higher than what the official numbers are also being told. And this is a key point, Martin. So we're going to put this slide up on the screen now. So this comes from the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is part of the federal government here in Australia, Department of Health. So on the 27th of March, they put out a note to health professionals, i.e. doctors, about this test, and they said, quote, "The extent to which a positive PCR result correlates with the infectious state of an individual is still being determined." So even our own government only in the last 3 weeks said we're using this test all around the country, but we don't know exactly how accurate the test is. So this says to me is when you see media reports about infection rates, whether here or around the world, and people are making certain claims about it's getting better, we're over the curve, we're flattening the curve, all of this is bogus because they don't have an accurate reading about the infections. So that's my issues on the issues in terms of the infections. Now, controversially, I should say that in the last 48 hours, Stanford University put out a study. Now, there's been some sort of argy-bargy among scientists about this study, but they've said that according to their analysis, they did a study on Santa Clara County, which is in California, and they found that the infection rate is anywhere between 50 to 85 times higher than the official count. So that, again, says that the rate of infections is much higher relative to what we're being told, because we're being told that this is a very lethal virus based on the number of deaths and the number of infections. Therefore, we must lock down, we must do social distancing, etc. So these data points I've just suggested is the level of infections is way higher than what the public's being told. Therefore, if more people have it and they're asymptomatic or the test results are basically faulty, it's not as lethal as what we're being told. So that's on the infection rate. Now, on the death rates, so a couple of points to make here is it's factual to say no one knows how many people have died of the virus. So we have a death count, and we have certain places around the world where this death count is quite explosive. But there's a couple of issues with this. So let me go to the UK first. So we had Neil Ferguson, who I just mentioned about his faulty modelling, but he testified to the UK Parliament on the 25th of March, and he was asked by one of the parliamentarians, had there been no virus, how many of those that have died would have died anyway? He said anywhere between 50 to 66% potentially. Now, why did he say that? Because a lot of the people who are dying from this virus, you have some high-risk categories. The elderly, people with pre-existing respiratory conditions, and people who have other health complications like obesity. So that's an issue with the UK. Now, in terms of Italy, so a couple of points to make here is the scientific advisor to Italian's health minister said in March that only 12% of death certificates has shown a direct causality with the virus. Even though, so we've got this large amount of Italians dying, and only 12% of the death certificates are saying that they're dying from the virus, number one. Now, number two is, so Dr. Deborah Bricks, who's the head of the White House coronavirus task force, she said in the last fortnight that a majority of Italians who are recorded as dying from the virus have not just one, but 3 or more pre-existing conditions. So that says to me that a lot of these people who have died who were already very sick. Now the question is, was their existing health issues the factor of why they died? Was it the virus? If there was no virus, how many of those would have died anyway? These are questions we don't know. But again, my issue for raising these points, Martin, is to say that we're locking down the economy where there's a whole bunch of healthy people, and we're saying these healthy people, which are basically people under 50, they're the ones who could be at higher risk, and yet we're seeing that there are some particular high risk categories that should be actually tried to be looked after rather than locking down the economy. So that's the Italian situation. Now with the US, so again, Dr. Bricks said that the US has taken a liberal approach. So in the United States, basically, if someone dies with if someone's passed away and they have the virus, they're saying they died from the virus. So there too, this is of correlation, not causation. So that's a big issue. But another thing that is happening in the US, Martin, is that if you die and you have the symptoms of the virus, they are presuming you had the virus, and they're not actually testing that you had the virus or not. So in some cases, you may look sick, you may look like you had the virus, and they're just recording you as someone who died from the virus, even though then technically in some cases they haven't tested to see whether you actually had the virus or not. So what that says to me is that the death rate in some of these places around the world have been artificially inflated, and we don't have an accurate death count. So basically, the research I found is that basically the level of infections has been underestimated. But perhaps the contagiousness of the virus is actually higher than what the official estimates say. The official death count in certain jurisdictions has been inflated high because they're just saying if you die with it, you died from it, and that's not the same thing. And all this means is that the lethality of the virus, in my view, has been overestimated, and that to me is a critical mistake, and that to me does not justify locking down the Australian economy. Now, one thing we won't go into a lot of detail in this show is that it's interesting that you do have a few countries around the world that have a high level of population density that you haven't seen a massive explosive breakout of infections or deaths like in, say, China, Iran, Italy, UK, or Spain, for example. And some countries I would point to is India, Egypt, and to a lesser extent, places in South America. So now there's a couple of theories as to why some countries in the Southern Hemisphere or on the equator are not getting it. Some of it is to, some say that the coronavirus spreads more rapidly when it's colder. And there are some other theories that I sort of talk about in my article as well from other scientists, and we won't get into that particular theory today. But I think the key point on there is that we're in the Southern Hemisphere. So when Morrison was told 150,000 people would die, well, where did that number came from? I mean, you had the Doherty Institute from Melbourne that took the data from Wuhan. They basically put it into a model similar to what Imperial College, what they have been using, and they basically came up with an estimate of 150,000 people potentially dying. So I think that was a key mistake, because we've seen other examples of countries on the equator or in the Southern Hemisphere that have not had the same level of fatality as some of the countries in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's a different conversation for a different day. But these are my key reasons why I say that the decision to lock down the economy from a public health reason, that was completely wrong. I mean, when people say this is very dangerous, I mean, now I'm going to be quite controversial. I think it's a scam. I honestly do not believe that it is as dangerous as what we've been led to believe, and therefore the decision to lock down, the decision to roll out this record stimulus is not justified in my view. So this is my position, but I know that you disagree. So over to you with your rebuttal.
Okay, John. Well, I come from it from a slightly different perspective insofar that we are where we are, right? So we've locked down for about a month and we've probably got another month to go. And the question is it now possible that we could get to the point where we get to zero transmission, which of course is what New Zealand is trying to get to. Now, if you'd asked me 3 or 4 weeks ago, I would have been quite skeptical of that. But given what we're seeing, and I take on notice your point about the testing, but nevertheless, the actual live cases and the deaths do seem to be decaying away. And so therefore, there is at least a possibility of getting to zero. And if we got to zero, that would mean, a bit like Taiwan, we could actually bring our economy back on stream full and firm, obviously still protections at the borders, but actually we could get back to business as normal here. So that's my first point. My second point is I am concerned about the unconstrained approaches that were used in the US and in the UK, and there are very high death counts in both those areas, much higher. And in fact, recently one of the main prime movers in the UK admitted that had they acted sooner, they could have probably reduced the total death rate considerably in the UK. They were late to the party. So unconstrained doesn't work. There has to be some controls. And my third point is that we are still, to an extent, thinking of this like an influenza type situation when it's not. The SARS characteristics and the MERS characteristics mean that it has to be handled differently. And whilst many people may or may not have symptoms or may only have mild symptoms, unfortunately, there are a proportion of the population who react very badly to it. And again, there is some evidence that is partly to do with those people who have other pre-existing conditions. But unfortunately, there is also now quite a body of evidence of some people who just react really badly to the virus, and it gets down into their lower lungs, and essentially they have other organ failures as well. So it is lethal. It can be lethal. And so I would argue that given where we are, rather than effectively turn the economy back on and go through a sequence of on-off events over many months or maybe even years, because I don't think there's necessarily any guarantee of a vaccine coming through, and whilst there might be better treatments later, they're not really around at the moment. The most obvious route from where we are is to hold the course for another 3 or 4 weeks, aim to get to zero, and with the view then to essentially opening up the economy immediately afterwards. Now, then we'd have to clean up the mess with regards to the financial issues, but that's for another argument. So, I'm arguing on a different basis, partly because of where we are, and partly because I think that there is a chance that we could get to zero, and if we could, then we could actually have an economy that is much more functional than those that are still struggling with it for a long period of time.
So how do let me just test you here, Martin. How can a government say that we're at zero when 50% of people are asymptomatic and the test that they're using has a 30% inaccuracy reading?
Well, you can only go with what tests you've got. I know the tests aren't very accurate, but nevertheless, if in fact you get no deaths over 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, then you're on the right path. That's a little bit what is happening in Taiwan, where I think they've had 3 or 4 deaths. So that's really the end outcome. If that's the end outcome that you have, then you've won.
Sure. Okay. All right. So all right. I mean, so okay. So where we're going to end up in terms of concluding for this show, Martin, is that so I think we both say that had you and I both been in charge, we would have taken early action in January. We would have locked down the border, put people into quarantine, testing at ports of entry, very similar to what we did in Australia did in 1918-19, and no lockdown of the general economy, no need for stimulus. A bit of a short-term economic hit, but everything would have been it would have been okay. A bit of a hit, but it wouldn't have been bad. But I guess where we disagree is. So when you say that for some people it is lethal, I mean, I don't dispute that. But the question is it lethal enough to justify locking down the economy and basically bankrupting the country? That to me, I don't think that test has been made. And
but John, we are where we are, right? So we are locked down. So what would you do? Would you unlock the economy now?
Well, yes. So now, so I'm glad you asked that question. So now. The issue with the UK is now in March, the key modeller for the UK government, Professor Graham Medley, he said on the BBC, and this was a very controversial interview that blew up within 24 hours. He said his strategy would be to let the virus spread, build herd immunity, but to take extra precautions for those who are in the high risk categories. So because he said, if you lock down and you unlock before a vaccine, you're basically going to go back to square one. So now, within 24 hours, his comments on the BBC blew up, and then basically the UK government was told, well, if you follow Professor Medley's advice, 250,000 people would die. Well, that claim comes from Imperial College, which these numbers, look, in my view, don't bear out. Now, one of the things that I have done is that so there are some professors in biology who are looking at this very closely in Australia, and I've had the opportunity to speak to his name's Professor Ted Steele. He and I have had a few conversations on the phone, and we've had some lively email exchanges as well. So his view is exactly the same as Professor Medley in terms of unlock the economy, take extra precautions for high-risk individuals. And so we sort of have an idea as to who those people are. So elderly, pre-existing respiratory conditions, people with obesity, etc. Maybe isolate those people, or maybe have some additional extra testing for them. But for everyone else, it needs to get back to normal. Because I don't think the lethality of the virus, the claims about it don't stack up. And we're ruining. Well, it's not just in this country, but around the world. There's a question of is the response actually going to cause more harm than the virus itself? And I've taken the view that it has, and it will go going forward.
Okay, very interesting. So there's a couple of observations there. The World Health Organization just came out and said problem with the testing for the antibodies is that it's starting to show that, in fact, the antibodies decay quite quickly. So in other words, you get immunity for a short period of time, but there's not necessarily the prospect of herd immunity. So that's the first point. And so, early days, because this virus is quite new, but it looks as though there may not be the potential for herd immunity, which means that essentially it's going to come again and again and again unless you do something about it. Second point is, I guess, putting the acid on particular sectors of the community, and those who are older and those who are potentially a higher risk, may sound attractive, but that's still quite a large proportion of the population. And I guess the question is, if we did that for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years, you'd have to do it until a vaccine came through, and you never will be sure that a vaccine will come through. There are 70 being tested at the moment, or more now, but none of them necessarily will come through. They never got a vaccine for SARS, so you could be in a situation where a considerable proportion of the community is locked permanently away. And so my argument would be, given where we are and the prospect of potentially in a month getting to zero and therefore being effectively virus-free in Australia, is potentially the most attractive route and the least risky route, and the one that gives us the best platform for going forward. But, it's not a simple calculation, and I can understand why people could go the other way, but that's why I'm holding to my line, John.
Okay, all right. Well, so I think you've put your case and I've put my case. And again, I would encourage people to go to my website, adamseconomics.com, and read my 6,000 word essay. And I mean, there's a lot of new data that's come out since I finalized that essay. So I may write a new piece going forward. But it's over now to the audience to to respond to my views and Martin's views, and obviously to express a view as to who do they think has the better argument.
Well, interesting. Put your comments in the section below, and we'll be interested to see how things go. I will just add one point. I tend to value life over economic activity, and there are other people out there who are trading off life versus economic activity differently. But that is really the big question, isn't it? What is the right degree of trade-off between those two? And that is a really complicated ethical situation.
Yes. Well, I mean, so I think that for any political leader, when you face these big sort of consequential decisions, I mean, you in my view, you always have to take what's going to maximize the net benefit for the country, not just in the immediate term, but in the long term. So that's point one. And point two is that when you look at when you say you value life, well, I mean, there are definitely, we've talked about this, there are social costs from economic distress. I mean, we're starting to see some of that. So there are mental health issues. There are issues I've already heard of cases of suicide because of the lockdown. I mean, the government themselves have provided additional money because they heard an increased elevation of domestic violence. So, there are social and life costs that come from this particular decision. And so you obviously have to try to balance it out between good science and what is the what is the best for the country in the medium to long term. They've made the most disastrous decision that they could have, and it wasn't justified.
John, I appreciate your time today, and in the interest of the people, we will keep this very much to the fore over the next little while, because the critical decisions that are taken over the next few weeks will be very important.
True. I mean, look at what I mean. What I'll say is, not only are they important about what comes from here, what has come to pass in the last 4 or 5 weeks. I mean, the consequences of those decisions are going to be with us for the next 5 to 10 years, and people need to sort of try to come to terms with what has just happened and how are we going to try to recover from the last 5 weeks.
Yeah, and we'll cover that, I think, more in our next episode, which will be coming soon. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.